After the trip, I returned home and saw my belongings thrown out of the house onto the street. And a note that shocked me. I've always believed there's a certain kind of peace that comes with coming home. The steady hum of the harbor, the gulls fussing in the gray morning air, and that familiar ache in my knees as I step off the bus with my battered old suitcase in hand. There's nothing fancy about me. Just a woman who likes her routines and her radio, who still folds her cardigans and lines them up in the hall closet. Just so. That evening, as I made my way up the winding brick path to the porch, I was humming to myself. A little tune Arthur used to whistle while painting the window trim. There was the usual salt in the air and the heavy quiet that seems to blanket Port Blossom just before a storm. My heart felt light. I'd only been away 3 nights, off visiting my old college roommate, Dorothy, who still wears her hair in curlers and makes the world's worst egg salad. We'd laughed over old photographs, and for a little while, I'd let myself forget all the aches and empty spaces that sometimes fill my days. The porch lamp wasn't on. That was my first sign. I always leave it glowing yellow for myself, like a lighthouse beckoning a lost ship home. Instead, the whole house sat dark, the bay windows black as vacant eyes. Not a soul stirring behind the lace curtains. I paused, suitcase clutched tight, and felt a little shiver. Not from the cold, but from a sense that the world had shifted in my absence. Then I saw them. My things. My life packed into cardboard boxes and plastic bins, lined up in the hallway like unwanted donations at a church rummage sale. My favorite armchair, Arthur's armchair really, sat crooked and damp from the harbor mist, draped with an old sheet that stank of someone else's perfume. There was my hand-stitched quilt, the one with the frayed blue edging, folded atop a pile of cookbooks and loose photo albums. The sight of it all exposed to the elements hit me like a slap. And then my eyes landed on the note. Just a little white envelope taped to the back of that chair. I knew the handwriting immediately. Chloe's, with her elegant looping script that always looked like she was auditioning for a wedding invitation. My son's girlfriend. My heart thumped, hopeful for a moment, that maybe it was a welcome home, or some silly joke. I opened it, hands trembling. 6 words scrawled on a scrap of notebook paper. We needed the space. It's done. No greeting, no love, Julian. Not even a warning. Just a surgical strike, swift and cold. It was as if someone had pressed the mute button on my whole life. I stood there in the open doorway, the wind tugging at my hair, my own belongings stacked around me like evidence at a crime scene. I bent down and picked up a little porcelain music box. Arthur had given it to me on our first anniversary, and now the ballerina inside was snapped in half, her tiny porcelain arms reaching skyward in a silent scream. It echoed my own. I didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, confusion washed over me in waves. I checked the lock, still turned, the key I carried now meaningless. There was no sign of a break-in. No angry scribbles or accusations. Just the flat certainty of that note, and the sharp, perfumed sting of erasure. The house I'd tended all these years, each floorboard polished, each holiday meal cooked in the old cast iron, was no longer mine. My first reaction, darling? Hurt, of course. A deep, wrenching hurt that sat heavy in my chest and made me feel suddenly very old. But underneath it, a strange, clear-headed clarity started to creep in. A voice inside me, my mother's maybe, said, "Don't knock. Don't beg." There was a dignity to keep, and I wasn't about to surrender it, not even to my own child. So I did what women of my generation have always done, when faced with unthinkable betrayal. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and gathered what I could carry. My suitcase, the unbroken photo of Arthur, that frayed blue quilt. I took one last look at the house, the place where I'd mended skinned knees, cooked Sunday pot roast, listened to the radio in the soft blue dark. Then I turned and walked away, my footsteps swallowed by the harbor fog. No one came to the window. No one called out. Not even Julian. I didn't know where I would sleep that night. But I knew one thing. I would not knock on a door that had already been slammed shut in my face. There would be time for tears later perhaps, but for now, there was only the quiet dignity of walking away. And as the mist closed in around me, I promised myself, this wasn't the end. Not for me. Not yet. I couldn't bring myself to wander far from the house that night. Not at first. My legs are still good for their age, but my heart was moving through molasses. I found myself circling the block like a stray, dragging that battered suitcase behind me, the wheels bumping over cracks in the old brick walk. I suppose in some small part of my mind I was hoping it was all a mistake, that any minute the porch light would flick on and Julian would come running out, apologizing, saying it was all a misunderstanding. But the windows stayed black, and the only thing that greeted me was the hush of the harbor wind. I finally sat down right there on the curb, beside my stacked-up life. The mist was coming in thicker now, curling around my ankles. I thought about calling someone, Dorothy maybe, or even the pastor from church, but pride is a stubborn companion, and mine wouldn't let me move an inch. Instead, I did what mothers do in times of crisis. I started sorting. I needed something to do with my hands, something to keep the sorrow at bay, if only for a little while. I opened the topmost box, the one marked with faded masking tape in my own handwriting. Quilt plus photos. Inside was the old patchwork quilt I'd sewn when Julian was just a colicky baby, crying through those endless sleepless nights. I could still picture the little stitches, uneven at first, done by lamplight while Arthur read the sports pages beside me. The blue calico had faded, but the memories hadn't. I ran my fingers over the fabric, remembering the weight of a sleeping child in my lap, and the sweet smell of baby powder in the air. Beneath the quilt was a photograph, Arthur grinning, hair mussed by the wind, with Julian perched on his shoulders, both of them sunburned and squinting at the 4th of July parade. Arthur's smile looked so alive it almost hurt to see. And there behind them I could just make out our little house, bunting on the porch and a pie cooling in the window. There were other things too, my reading lamp, still with the little crochet doily tucked inside the shade. A stack of recipe cards, my mother's handwriting slanting across the yellowed index cards. Chicken and dumplings, peach cobbler, pot roast, Arthur's favorite. Each card a tiny time machine. And then tucked in a corner I found my music box. The one Arthur had given me on our first anniversary. Just a delicate porcelain thing with a ballerina twirling under a glass dome. Except now the ballerina was snapped in half, her pink tutu dusted with salt and dirt. I lifted it, hands trembling, and for a moment, it felt as though my own heart had cracked along with her. The melody, which once played Fascination Waltz, was silent now. Only the wind made any music. I traced my fingers over the shattered porcelain, and the tears finally came. Quiet at first, just a prickling in my eyes, then spilling over as I sat there in the lamplight, alone but for the ghosts of my own past. The world was so quiet, I could hear the harbor bells in the distance and the slow drip of water from the eaves. The real pain, though, didn't come from broken trinkets or lost treasures. No, honey, it was something deeper. It was the understanding, settling and cold and heavy, that my own child had orchestrated this. Julian, who I'd rocked through croup and chickenpox, who I'd taught to tie his shoes and spell Mississippi, had handed my life to someone else to discard. There was no angry fight, no ugly words. Just a silent eviction, neat and efficient, like taking out the garbage before the new tenants arrived. I sat there on the curb, my skirt getting damp, and thought about every birthday candle I'd lit for Julian, every lunchbox I'd packed. How many nights had I stayed up with a feverish child, wiping his brow and whispering prayers? And now all those years of care were stacked in soggy boxes, waiting for the trash collector. My heart ached, not just for myself, but for the child I'd loved so fiercely, who'd become a stranger to me in my own home. I remembered something my own mother once said long ago, after my father died and she had to sell our childhood house. It's not the walls that make a home, Mary, she told me, tucking a lock of my hair behind my ear. It's the people inside. I'd believed her all my life. But now, sitting in the cold with my ruined music box and my tears, I wondered if she'd ever had to face this kind of emptiness. I fought the loneliness, but it pressed in thick as the fog. There's a particular kind of sorrow in being left behind by the very people you once believed you were building a future for. It's not the stuff you lose. It's the story you thought you were a part of, suddenly rewritten without you. By the time I stood up, the night had settled fully, the kind of deep starless dark that makes you feel invisible. I gathered what I could, zipped my suitcase and started walking. No destination, just a slow march forward. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew the old version of my life had ended. Right there, on that curb in front of the only home I'd ever loved. And that, dear, was the hardest truth of all. That little piece of torn paper, the note, kept burning a hole in my pocket. 6 words. We needed the space. It's done. Not even my son's hand, but Chloe's with that practiced, elegant script of hers. I must have read it 20 times as I sat on that cold harbor bench, the words smudging a little where my thumb pressed too hard, as if I could rub out what she'd written and rewrite my story with a softer ending. I'm not proud, but I'll admit, there was a moment, maybe 2, when I almost marched right up to that door, pounded until my knuckles bled, and demanded to know why. But I couldn't do it, honey. Pride is a strange thing. It can keep you upright when grief wants you doubled over. My own mother used to say, never beg for love in a house where you once rocked the cradle. So I sat quietly instead, suitcase at my feet, that note heavy in my lap. I could see my old house from that bench, its gables outlined against the night sky, every window dark except for the faint blue flicker of the television in the living room. I wondered if Julian was inside, flipping channels the way he always did when he was anxious. I wondered if Chloe had made him a cup of tea, using the chipped old mug that used to be mine. Funny, the things your mind clings to when everything else is slipping away. The air was sharp and damp from the harbor, and as I pulled my cardigan tighter, I thought of happier nights. There was one years ago, when Julian was just a skinny, wide-eyed boy. We'd come down to this very bench, him in pajamas and rain boots, me with a thermos of cocoa and a wool blanket. We'd sit for hours watching the stars blink into being above the masts, making up stories about the ships anchored out in the bay. He'd point out constellations, Orion's belt, the Big Dipper, and ask if someday he could have a boat of his own. Someday when you're big, you'll take me for a ride, won't you? I'd say, and he'd nod, all solemn, as if he was promising me the world. That night, I missed that little boy more than I missed my house. I missed the way he'd rest his head on my shoulder and sigh, the way his hair always smelled faintly of the oatmeal shampoo I used to buy with coupons from the corner store. I sat and remembered the sound of distant gulls and the occasional clink of rigging my only company. The town was quiet, as if holding its breath. I tried to picture what Chloe and Julian were doing. If they were celebrating. If they even noticed the empty spaces my things had left behind. I wondered if my quilt still held the scent of lavender from my linen closet, or if Chloe had washed it all away. The harbor lights flickered. A couple passed by, hand in hand, whispering and laughing. I watched them go, and for a moment I let myself imagine that I, too, was young and wanted and not so terribly, terribly alone. When the chill crept up through my shoes and settled in my bones, I stood and walked a while. The note crumpled tight in my fist. I ended up back at the bench, watching the world turn cold and silver. I must have looked a sight. A small woman with wild hair and damp eyes, hugging herself against the wind. But I wasn't ready to call anyone. Not Dorothy, not even the bridge girls. I wasn't ready for their pity, their gentle offers of help, or their murmured, "You're always welcome here, dear." I just needed quiet. The honest quiet of the night. I read the note again, tracing Chloe's loops and swirls, thinking of all the times I'd traced Julian's handwriting on birthday cards, spelling errors and all. I tried to picture his hand in this, but it was as if he'd vanished completely, replaced by someone else's ambition. My son was gone, replaced by a man I barely recognized. The sky above the harbor began to lighten, just a little, hinting at dawn. I pulled out my old photograph, Arthur's smiling face, young and full of hope, and held it close. "What would you do?" I whispered, half expecting an answer. But the only reply was the gulls and the hush of the water. So I tucked the note and the photo back into my bag, wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, and watched the world wake up. I told myself quietly, firmly, that I would not be erased. Not by a piece of paper. Not by anyone. And as the first pale sunlight crept across the harbor, I decided that this would not be the night that broke me. No, darling. I was down, but I was not finished. Not yet. Morning in Port Blossom always comes slowly, as if the sun is too polite to wake the town all at once. That day, though, I watched the world change in silvery slices from my harbor bench, feeling every ache in my bones. My back hurt and my pride hurt worse. But the city was waking up, and so I told myself, must I? I didn't go home. Couldn't really. Instead, I wandered the quiet streets, suitcase in one hand, quilt folded under my arm for comfort. The sidewalks were slick with dew, and the seagulls were already squabbling over yesterday's sandwich crusts. I kept walking, not from purpose but out of a restless ache that wouldn't let me sit still. I passed the bakery, the sweet smell of cinnamon rolls tempting but somehow cruel. The same way a family's laughter through a window can sting a lonely soul. I drifted through the familiar neighborhood, each block a patchwork of memories. Mrs. Doyle's rosebush, Mr. Avery's sagging porch swing, the crabapple tree that Julian once tried to climb before skinning his knees. Every step, some ghost of the past reached for me. But I kept going, lost in thought, until I found myself standing at the corner where the new townhouses gleamed bright and untroubled in the morning sun. They'd talked about those houses at supper once, Julian and Chloe. I remember Chloe's eyes lighting up as she waved a glossy brochure, showing off kitchens that looked more like laboratories than places to bake bread. Julian had nodded along, but I'd seen something flicker in his eyes, uncertainty maybe, or just weariness. I tried to steer the conversation to safer ground, but Chloe was relentless, ambition wrapped in silk and pearls. Now here I was staring across a patch of perfectly clipped grass and glass so clean you'd swear it wasn't there. I never meant to spy, heavens, I've never been a snoop, but something drew me close, that old pull of curiosity mixed with dread. I stood there, hidden behind a curtain of rhododendrons, peering through the big window of the corner unit. My own son, my own flesh and blood, was inside. Julian stood at the dining table, back straight but shoulders slumped. Chloe was with him, flipping through a catalog, her finger jabbing at photographs of granite counters and sparkling appliances. She was all energy, laughing, talking, pushing. I watched her point at a page and toss her hair, that bright, sharp laugh of hers bouncing off the high ceilings. She looked every bit the star of her own show. And Julian, well, he looked tired. He reached for a coffee mug, lifted it halfway, then set it down again. He was nodding but not really listening. I recognized that slump, the same way he'd look when he was 12 and in trouble, caught between telling the truth and keeping the peace. There was no trace of me in that room. None of the old kitchen towels I embroidered. None of the yellow mixing bowls I used to whip up pancake batter on Sunday mornings. No sign, in fact, that I'd ever existed at all. Instead, there was Chloe holding up her catalog like a prize. I watched her gesture at a sleek countertop, excitement radiating off her in waves, as if nothing stood between her and the life she'd always wanted. For a second, a long aching second, I thought Julian saw me. His gaze drifted toward the window, eyes unfocused. My heart thudded, a wild hope flickering. But he didn't see me. He just stared right through, lost in his own thoughts. It hit me, there on that tidy sidewalk, just how easy it was to erase someone. Not with shouting or slamming doors, but with quiet choices, small erasures, and pretty things replacing the battered and beloved. I realized then that this wasn't about needing space. This was about being replaced. Not just my things, but my role, my memories, my history. Chloe and Julian weren't just pushing me out of the house. They were pushing me out of their story, making space for a life that no longer included me. That realization stung sharper than any note. I felt it all, the anger, the sorrow, the slow-burning betrayal. I stood there, watching as Chloe waved her magazine, planning a future in which I was nothing but a shadow in the margins. I left quietly, unnoticed, the sun warm on my back and my heart colder than it had been all night. I found a quiet bench outside the bakery and sat with my quilt and my suitcase, breathing in the scent of rising dough and trying not to cry. But as I sat there, something else began to grow inside me. Something steadier than grief, quieter than rage. Maybe it was resolve, or maybe just the stubbornness that's carried me through all the storms of my life. Either way, I knew one thing. I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. After that morning, I saw my life with new eyes. Every moment felt suspended, as if the world was holding its breath and waiting to see what I'd do next. I sat for a long time in front of that bakery, my quilt folded over my knees, the warmth of rising bread a poor substitute for the comfort of family. The town moved around me, neighbors in their Sunday best, children skipping to the corner store. A young mother with a stroller and a shopping list clutched in one hand. But for me, time slowed down. I kept replaying what I'd seen in that glass house. Chloe's hungry ambition, Julian's lost gaze. The emptiness in his posture was familiar. He looked like a boy again, waiting for me to rescue him from a mess of his own making. But this time I wasn't sure I wanted to, or even could. That's when all the odd little things from the past few months started to bubble up in my memory, sharper now in the clear light of betrayal. I remembered Chloe's sudden interest in the household accounts. She'd insisted on helping. Just to get us organized, Mom. And before I knew it, she'd collected the utility bills, insurance forms, even my checkbook. At first, I told myself it was kindness, a way for her to feel part of the family. But then she asked for passwords. For online payments, you know how confusing it gets. I'd hesitated, but Julian had pressed me. It's fine, Mom, she's just helping. After that, little things changed. The mail started coming addressed to Julian and then more and more to Chloe. Once I found a legal-looking envelope on the kitchen counter. Nothing alarming, just to current resident. But when I picked it up, Chloe swooped in and snatched it before I could look. Just junk, she said, smiling that tight, shiny smile of hers. I brushed it off or tried to. I wanted so badly to believe that family could never turn on you so coldly. But looking back, I could see the pieces lining up like dominoes. She'd changed the utilities to their names, redirected the magazine subscriptions. The last straw was the bank statement, forwarded to their new digital mailbox. I remember asking Julian about it. He'd looked away, mumbling something about simplifying things. I should have pressed harder, but I was tired and I wanted peace. Now every detail came rushing back. Chloe's casual lies. I'll handle the property taxes, you don't need to worry about it, Mom. And her endless suggestions to update paperwork, just in case. She'd even called my doctor's office, just helping Mom stay on top of appointments. It all seemed so helpful, so modern. I'd raised Julian to be polite, to trust, and now I realized maybe I'd raised him to be a little too gentle in the face of someone else's push. But the weight of betrayal pressed hardest when I remembered Julian's silence. Not once had he stood between Chloe and me. Not once had he said, "Wait, Mom, let's talk about this." He just let it happen, one small surrender at a time. I wondered, sitting on that bakery bench, if he felt trapped, or if he simply didn't care. There's a special hurt in realizing your child can watch you drown and do nothing to save you. The loneliness was a living thing. It crept under my skin and whispered all the old doubts. Was I too stubborn, too set in my ways? Had I made it too easy to erase me? But then I remembered the birthday cakes, the late-night fevers, the Christmas mornings when Julian's eyes lit up with joy. I remembered Arthur's words so many years ago. Mary, you are the backbone of this family. Don't let anyone make you feel small. He'd meant it as comfort, but now it felt like a battle cry. It was time to fight for what was mine. Maybe not with fists or angry words, but with the quiet, steady resolve that only years of living can teach you. I might have been pushed out of my own home, my treasures scattered like confetti, but I was not going to be erased without a fight. I'd seen storms before, and I'd learned to survive them, by planting my feet, taking stock, and finding the strength in my own two hands. I decided then and there that I wouldn't go quietly. If Chloe and Julian wanted a battle over my life, well, I'd give them one. But I wouldn't do it alone. I needed help, a good friend, someone who remembered me before I was an inconvenience, someone who understood what family really meant. So I stood up, gathering my things, and started down the sidewalk toward the bus stop. The wind off the harbor had changed. It was colder now, but it carried the promise of a new direction. I was tired, yes, but I was also angry. And darling, you don't know the strength of a grandmother until you try to take her life from her. The storm was gathering, and this time I was ready for it. There are moments in a woman's life when she finds herself counting back, searching for the old anchors, the friends who saw her through first heartbreak, first laugh lines, all the twists and turns. I thought of this as I waited at the bus stop, my suitcase heavy, but my heart heavier still. It wasn't pride that kept me from calling Julian. No, it was the knowledge that the boy I raised, the one who used to bring me dandelion bouquets and whispered secrets, wasn't the one who'd locked me out. That boy, I hoped, was still somewhere deep inside him, hidden behind the silence Chloe had built. I didn't want pity. I wanted an ally, someone who knew the old me, the one with paint under her nails and strong opinions about pie crust. That's how I found myself dialing the number of the only person who'd ever seen me cry over a burnt casserole and stand her ground against a room full of men. Ruth Ellen Bailey. Ruth Ellen and I go back further than I care to admit. We met at the church social in 1968, both of us elbow-deep in biscuit dough and up to our ears in gossip. She was the one who taught me the secret to fluffy biscuits. Never twist the cutter, just press. And I taught her the trick for apple pie with a touch of sharp cheddar in the crust. We raised babies together, swapped hand-me-downs, and sat side by side through every community meeting and school bake sale. But Ruth Ellen wasn't just my confidant. She'd gone and become a lawyer, back in the days when folks still raised their eyebrows at a woman in a suit. She was sharp as a tack, with a laugh that could cut through the thickest fog, and a heart big enough to remember everyone's birthday. She'd retired a few years back, but I knew she still kept her books in order and her mind even sharper. Mary. Her voice on the other end of the line was like balm. Is that you? Good heavens, I was just thinking of you this morning. My daffodils are sprouting, and I remembered your mother's story about the blizzard of '57. I couldn't help but smile, even with tears threatening. It's me, Ruth Ellen. Well, I could use some company. Do you have a little time? She didn't ask questions. Not then. She just said, "You come right over, honey. I've got the percolator going and a fresh lemon pound cake cooling. We'll sort it all out." I rode the bus to her house, hugging my quilt and trying to keep my thoughts from running in circles. Ruth Ellen met me at the door, flower on her cheek, hair pulled back with a red bandana, and she swept me into a hug so strong it made me feel 10 years younger. Inside, her kitchen smelled like lemon and coffee. A safe place, a little world untouched by betrayal. I told her everything. I spilled every detail. The note, the boxes in the hall, the silent eviction, the glass window where I'd seen Julian and Chloe building a new life with my history swept clean. She listened the way only old friends can, her eyes full of fire. When I finished, she reached over and patted my hand. "Now, Mary, let's get something straight. Just because you're a grandmother doesn't mean you're powerless. You've got more grit in your pinky than half this town combined. And they may have surprised you, but that's only the first inning. This game isn't over. She poured me coffee, real coffee, none of that fancy stuff Chloe liked, and sliced me a piece of pound cake. The world felt a little less heavy with each bite. Then Ruth Ellen put on her glasses, pulled out a yellow notepad and started scribbling. "Let's talk about the house," she said. "Who owns it? Whose name is on the deed? Do you have a will? Any letters, any receipts, anything that shows you belong there?" I hadn't thought much about the paperwork. I was always more of a bread-and-butter kind of woman, trusting that love and family would keep the roof over my head. But Ruth Ellen reminded me, "A good deed and a good deed are two different things, Mary. You need proof. We're going to gather every scrap." I looked at her, tears stinging, but feeling hope for the first time in days. "You really think I can fight this?" She grinned, all sass and steel. "Honey, you baked pies for the church auction during a power outage. You raised a son through whooping cough, lost Arthur and didn't let it break you. If anyone can stand up to this, it's you. And you're not doing it alone." So we sat, drinking coffee until the pot ran dry, Ruth Ellen writing a list longer than a Thanksgiving shopping trip. For the first time since my world fell apart, I felt something strong and steady inside me. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Because, my darling, when the storm hits hardest, that's when you find out who your real friends are. And if you're lucky, they come with coffee and a plan. It's a peculiar comfort, sitting at a friend's kitchen table surrounded by stacks of folders, dusty photo albums, and a mountain of old receipts. Ruth Ellen's kitchen, bright with morning light and crowded with the smell of lemon pound cake and fresh coffee, became our war room. There's nothing quite like the sound of two determined women, one with a notepad, one with a box of old tax returns, when they're on a mission. Ruth Ellen started by making a list. "Mary, we need deeds, tax records, utility bills in your name, insurance paperwork, anything that ties you to that house." She clicked her pen with a snap, "All business. Don't forget, darling. Sometimes it's the little scraps tucked into cookbooks and desk drawers that tell the truth best." So we dug. Out came the battered blue accordion folder where I kept every important paper, held together with a faded rubber band. I had never been a meticulous record keeper like Arthur, but I did have a stubborn habit of not throwing much away. There were mortgage statements with Arthur's name and mine, old property tax bills, letters from the bank. I'd tucked away the original deed to the house in a children's book years ago, thinking it'd be safe with the fairy tales. Ruth Ellen grinned when I produced it. Never underestimate the hiding places of a mother. We laid everything out on the table. The deed, several years' worth of paid property taxes, insurance bills, all in my name or Arthur's. Ruth Ellen inspected them one by one, her brow furrowed. "This is good, Mary. Real good. It proves you own the place, not Julian, not Chloe." She looked up at me, her eyes bright. "We'll need more, though, something showing you live there, not just own it." That's when we found the receipts. New roof work, paint from last summer, even a plumber's invoice for the kitchen sink Chloe had insisted needed replacing. Each one with my name and the house address. We made copies of everything. Ruth Ellen even took photographs, her old camera clicking away like a detective's sidekick. "Evidence, honey," she said. "We're not leaving a single stone unturned." But it wasn't all paperwork. I went through old drawers and boxes that still smelled of lavender and old newspaper. That's where I found Arthur's letter, one I hadn't seen since the weeks after his passing. The envelope was yellowed with time, the ink faded but legible. In his unmistakable hand, Arthur had written, "If anything happens to me, Mary is to remain in our home for as long as she wishes. This house is hers." My eyes filled as I read it, hearing his voice as clear as ever. I showed Ruth Ellen, and she pressed the letter to her heart for a moment before nodding. That's a gift, Mary. It may not be legal on its own, but it shows intent, and sometimes that's enough for a judge to listen. We kept digging, and with every folder, every slip of paper, my heart grew lighter. But Ruth Ellen was too sharp not to notice something was off in Chloe's so-called organization. She flipped through the stack of updated documents Chloe had left out after her last helpful visit. Look here. See how the signature page on this form looks different from the rest? She held it up, the light catching the faint difference in paper. That's a red flag, Mary. It looks like someone may have tried to slip in a new document among the old ones. We compared signatures, dates, even the thickness of the paper. Ruth Ellen made notes in her neat lawyer's script, muttering, "Forgery, or at least manipulation. This is bigger than a family spat, Mary. This is fraud." We both sat back, the weight of it settling over us. I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. I wasn't losing my mind after all, not about the accounts, the mail, the sneaky paperwork. Chloe hadn't just tried to edge me out, she tried to erase me on paper too. For the first time in weeks, I looked out Ruth Ellen's window and saw the world in color again. The daffodils bobbing, the harbor sparkling just past the rooftops. I wasn't just fighting for my home. I was fighting for the story of my life. My marriage, my motherhood. My right to exist in the place where every wall echoed with laughter and loss. We packed everything up, photos, letters, bills, Arthur's last note, into a neat pile, ready to march right into any office that would listen. Ruth Ellen patted my hand, the soft skin of her fingers still strong. "You're not alone, Mary. And you're not beaten. Not by a long shot." As the sun set, casting golden light over the kitchen table, I felt something bloom inside me. Hope? Yes, but also the fierce old stubbornness that had gotten me through so many storms. My roots went deep in that house, and now I had proof. The time for quiet had passed. It was time to stand up and reclaim what was mine. The day of the confrontation dawned gray and cool, the kind of day that sets the harbor sighing and sends the seagulls hunched and grumpy atop the lampposts. I woke at Ruth Ellen's, heart pounding, hands restless. She made me oatmeal with brown sugar. "For strength," she said, pressing my shoulder with her warm, steady palm. I wore my best skirt, the navy one I'd saved for important occasions, and tied my hair back tight so I'd feel less like an old woman and more like the mother and wife I'd always been. Ruth Ellen stacked our thick folder of evidence, receipts, deeds, Arthur's letter, even the photographs of my quilt and music box, and tucked it all into her worn leather briefcase. "You ready, Mary?" she asked, not unkindly, but with that lawyer's firmness she always slipped on like a pair of gloves. I swallowed, nodded, and together we set off, two old friends walking with purpose, as if we'd been training for this march all our lives. Julian and Chloe were waiting at the house. My house. I saw them through the frosted glass as we came up the walk, Chloe pacing, phone in hand, lips pressed tight. Julian at the window, shoulders slumped, twisting his wedding ring the way Arthur used to do when he was troubled. The sight of them made my heart lurch, but Ruth Ellen squeezed my arm. "Deep breath, honey. Remember, you are right and you are not alone." Inside, the air felt wrong. Too cold, too quiet. That chilly hush you only notice when something precious is on the line. Chloe barely looked at me as we stepped in, but she managed a thin smile, all teeth, no warmth. "Mary, we didn't expect." Ruth Ellen cut her off, setting the briefcase squarely on the dining table. "That's Mrs. Sloane to you, and she has every right to be here." Julian's eyes darted from me to Ruth Ellen, searching for an anchor. He looked so lost in that moment, I almost reached for his hand. But I kept still, holding my quilt for comfort, letting Ruth Ellen lead. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "About the house. About the papers. About what's been done in my name, without my consent." Chloe bristled, but Ruth Ellen was ready. Out came the documents, each one set in a neat pile. The deed with my name, the tax records, the receipts with my signature. She laid Arthur's letter in front of them, the familiar script catching the light. "This is a clear record," Ruth Ellen said, voice calm and clipped, "of ownership, residency, and intent. Mary has every legal and moral right to remain in her home." Chloe scoffed, folding her arms. "We needed space. Julian and I are building a future." She was always talking about downsizing. I cut her off, the heat finally rising in my voice. "Not like this. Not with my things out in the damp and a note from you taped to my own chair. I wasn't even given the decency of a conversation. Just erased. I raised Julian here. I cared for Arthur here. I built this home with my own 2 hands, every quilt, every flower in the garden. You don't just throw that away." Julian opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time he really looked at me, saw me I think as more than an obstacle. "Mom," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want," Chloe said, "it would be easier if we just made a clean break. I thought you'd understand." I shook my head, tears stinging. "You thought wrong. I would have helped. I would have listened. But this?" I gestured to the pile of evidence, the neat, hard proof of my life. "This is betrayal. Not just by Chloe but by you, Julian. By your silence." Ruth Ellen's gaze was sharp as a needle. "There's more," she said, producing the suspicious documents Chloe had slipped into the paperwork. "These forms, dates and signatures don't match. Pages swapped. This is evidence of fraud. And we're prepared to go to court." The room went quiet, the only sound the distant slap of the harbor against the rocks. Chloe's face paled, her composure slipping. "You can't prove." "We can," Ruth Ellen replied, sliding the stack of photographs and receipts closer. "We have everything we need. And we're not afraid to use it." The confrontation stretched, raw and exposed. Voices rose. Chloe sharp with fear, Julian soft with regret. In the end, Ruth Ellen stood up, her lawyer's voice ringing clear. "It's your turn to choose, Julian. Your wife or your mother. Your silence or the truth." I looked at my son, my boy, my grown man, and for a moment saw the child he used to be, the one who'd bring me seashells and wildflowers. I didn't want to force this reckoning, but it had come all the same. Sometimes a mother has to fight for her place in the very world she built. As I stood there, quilt in hand, Ruth Ellen by my side, I knew. Whatever happened next, I was done being erased. I was Mary Sloan. I was here and I was home. It's a strange thing, walking into a courthouse for the first time in your life at my age. Ruth Ellen and I sat side by side on the hard wooden bench, our folder of evidence neatly stacked between us. My hands were folded in my lap, but my mind was restless as a bird, fluttering from memory to memory. The walls smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. I remember thinking how odd it was that a place so cold could decide the fate of something as warm and lived in as a home. The judge was a woman, hair streaked with silver, eyes sharp and kind. When our case was called, Ruth Ellen led me forward, every step measured, her presence a comfort and a shield. Chloe and Julian sat across from us, Chloe rigid, chin high, and Julian pale, unable to meet my eyes. Ruth Ellen began, her voice as steady as a church bell. She presented every scrap of evidence. The deed in my name, the bills, the receipts for repairs, Arthur's letter, even photographs of my ruined belongings. Each paper was a small piece of my life, proof that I belonged. Chloe's lawyer tried to protest, arguing about future plans and right to quiet enjoyment. But Ruth Ellen shut it down with a wave of her hand and a point-by-point recitation of the law. When my turn came, I spoke quietly but firmly. I told the judge about raising Julian in that house, about Arthur, about the decades of holidays, laughter, and loss held within those walls. I told her how it felt to come home and find myself locked out, my things piled up like garbage in the hallway, my life reduced to a single cold note. My voice trembled, but I looked Chloe in the eye and I saw for just a second something like shame. Chloe's side tried to claim I'd agreed to leave, that it was all for my own good. They produced documents, clumsy, mismatched, some forged, as Ruth Ellen had already proved. The judge's eyes narrowed as Ruth Ellen laid out the timeline, the discrepancies in the paperwork, the clear evidence of manipulation. Then Julian was asked to speak. My heart clenched. He stood, voice barely above a whisper, and admitted he'd let Chloe handle everything. I didn't want to hurt anyone, he said, his eyes glistening. But I see now how much hurt I've caused by not standing up for my own mother. He looked at me, truly looked for the first time in months, and I felt both pride and pain. After the arguments ended, we waited. Felt like a lifetime, but finally the judge spoke. This court finds the eviction unlawful. The evidence of fraud is clear. Mrs. Sloan, you retain the legal right to your home. The defendants must vacate the premises immediately. I heard Chloe gasp, a sharp sound that barely moved me. The judge continued, recommending charges for fraud and forgery against Chloe. The gavel fell, a hard, clear sound, and just like that the storm had passed. Ruth Ellen squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. I stood a little shaky but with my head high, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the full weight of my own dignity. I was going home. Coming back to my own front door felt different this time, and not just because my knees ached from the courthouse stairs. I paused on the porch, the afternoon sun warm on my shoulders, my old key heavy in my hand. There was no bitterness, only relief, like the hush after a summer thunderstorm, when you realize nothing has broken that can't be mended. Inside, the air was musty, boxes still crowding the hallway. I set down my suitcase and stood for a moment, letting it all sink in. The house wasn't quite as I remembered. My favorite chair still smelled faintly of Chloe's perfume, and my quilt was folded wrong, the blue edge tucked under instead of out. But it was mine. Every creak in the floorboards, every faded photograph, every little scratch on the kitchen counter was part of my story. I moved quietly through each room, setting things right. A vase here, a cushion there, tucking Arthur's photo back on the mantel where it belonged. The broken music box sat on the table, the ballerina still silent and snapped, but I left her there. Not all scars need hiding. They remind us what we've survived. I didn't pretend everything was perfect. There were places in the house that felt emptier, and memories that stung as much as they comforted. But I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window overlooking the harbor, the same spot where Julian once pressed his little face to the glass and named every boat he could see. The sun danced on the water, just as it always had, and I found myself breathing a little easier. I forgave what I could, for my own sake if nothing else. I forgave Julian in time. He was still my son, lost as he was, and I hoped someday he'd find his way back to the mother who once read him stories in this very chair. As for Chloe, I let her go. Some folks pass through your life to teach you hard lessons about love, trust, and standing up for yourself. I didn't wish her harm. I simply wished her gone. As evening fell, I opened the window wide. The salt breeze slipped in, carrying the sounds of gulls and distant laughter. I sipped my tea and felt something like peace settle around me, soft and sturdy as the quilt across my knees. This house was still my home. My heart was still my own. And so, as the harbor lights flickered on, I sat with gratitude for the life I'd lived, the friends who'd stood by me, and the strength I never knew I had until I needed it most. The world felt wide open again, and for the first time in a long while, I was ready for whatever tomorrow might bring.